Hello, I'm Brenda Schivito, and welcome to You Are Not Alone, the place for news, tips, and stories of hope for people battling addiction. My guest today is Bill Koroncai, treatment advocate at Recovery Centers of America here in nearby Devon. Bill has information and firsthand experience about how early intervention is helping people win their battle with the disease of addiction. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming today, Bill.
Thank you for having me,
Nice to see
Brenda.
you.
Nice
Thank
to
you
see
so
you as
much.
well.
I'm so pleased that you're here today, and what we want to talk about today is how people can get into a rehabilitation facility.
Sure.
A loved one or someone says to themselves or to their loved ones, I need help. I'm struggling with addiction to substance, alcohol, whatever it may be with this situation. So they come to you and they say, I got to get help. So what do we do as families? What do you think the first thing, or what can you tell us we should do?
Sure. So hear this question all the time. And just like anything else, sometimes people are fortunate enough to have someone in their extended network that has had experience with a nearby treatment facility, and you can always run the question by them and see where they went and what their experience was like. Most people usually hit up Google and start Googling places, but then the question from there becomes, what's the best place? What am I looking for? How do I distinguish between, a good provider, a reputable provider? What's going to be best for my loved one, right?
Sure.
And so we get into that, and typically what I recommend someone look for are a couple things. So one would be, what levels of care are offered? Is it a detox facility? Do they offer residential inpatient? Do they offer different levels of outpatient care? Do they offer medication-assisted treatment? What different modalities towards treatment do they offer? Those kinds of things. Some other factors I would say that kind of help distinguish a reputable provider from maybe a less than reputable provider would be therapist to patient ratios. Are the clinicians master's level clinicians on site? Do they have 24/7 medical supervision? Is the facility going to be safe and comfortable for my loved one? A lot of times, I've personally taken a lot of families on tours of our facility, and once they see the place, they know that this is a place that my loved one's going to be safe and comfortable. So.
Okay, can we just go back to what you said, levels of care? You mentioned detox. Can you explain what does that mean?
Sure. So detox is usually the first step in the rehabilitation process. So if someone's actively using particularly substances like alcohol and benzodiazepines, the detox process can actually be fatal. Because coming off of those substances, you can actually have seizures, and it can be deadly if it's not medically monitored. So in the case of opiates and some other substances, the detox process can often just be highly, highly uncomfortable, like a wicked case of the flu or something like that, in which case, when someone tries to detox on their own, day two, if they're feeling like crap, their first instinct is going to be to run out the door and go use again, right? So it's important that they're comfortable and in a medically monitored setting during that initial detox process, which typically lasts anywhere from 5 to 7 days on average. So it's important to have them within the confines of a safe facility where they're going to be comfortable, where they're going to be checked on by medical professionals. And that's typically, again, the first 5 to 7 days from last usage to, again, 5 to 7 days into the recovery process.
Okay, so if it's, how do you determine then if outpatient would be the right choice? So tell me a little bit about outpatient. Is that something that somebody could do? Like they detox and then they go into outpatient, for instance. How would you know?
So typically, most reputable providers will do an on-site assessment and determine the best level of clinical care. In most cases that I've seen, detox is followed by a residential stay. It's not often that someone will go from needing a detox level of care to being, I don't want to call outpatient casual, but to go to something as less intensive as outpatient right out of the gate. So typically in between those two phases will be a residential inpatient stay. But to your point, if someone is not at the point where they require detox yet, then an outpatient stay might be what's most clinically appropriate. If they're not using every day, if they're maybe drinking a little harder than they wish to be on the weekends, for instance, but they're not drinking during the week, an outpatient stay might be the path for them.
Right. Okay. So what are some of the questions? Now, somebody calls, okay, they call a number, they Google something, and they call up the facility, and what should the questions be about? I mean, typically, any first phone call to any kind of medical treatment of any sort is what? What's your insurance?
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's the world that we live in.
It is.
And any facility, rightfully so, wants to know, how are we going to get paid?
Right.
So how do families or loved ones, how do they manage that?
Sure. So I would ask right out of the gate, what insurance providers are you in network with? Because in-network contracts make it a lot more affordable for the patient or the end user. Out-of-network contracts, while things work a little bit differently, and the price can go, it can be anywhere. I've seen it as high as $50,000.
Sure.
So to make it affordable and to make sure that you're not going to be responsible for a huge bill when your loved one is done treatment, you want to make sure that the facility that you're talking to is in network with your insurance carrier.
Okay. And so it's in-network versus out-of-network.
Correct.
So what if somebody, unfortunately, does not have the provision in their insurance, pardon me, for inpatient care, or they don't have insurance at all? Are there options out there that people can access?
There are. So I know from me and my team, half the calls that we get, maybe less than half the calls we get, are individuals that are actually admitting into our facility. We have a number of in-network contracts with most major insurance providers. That being said, I'd say over half the calls that we field every day are individuals who don't have insurance or maybe have state or federal insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing. And there are plenty of providers around who cater to those policies as well. So oftentimes what we do is a warm handoff to that facility to make sure that regardless of where that individual is going into treatment, that they're going into the best level of care that's affordable and accessible to them.
Sure. So not everybody can afford XYZ facilities.
Correct.
And here's a loved one, with the deer in headlights, like, as we know, this person needs treatment. They make the decision. They need treatment, like
Correct.
right now.
Correct.
I mean, my experience has been you have a very small window.
Very small window.
To get somebody the help they need.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. And the last thing we want to do is leave anyone, a loved one, a patient, feeling like they're out on their own. So the best thing we can do is be loving and supporting and carry them through that process until they establish contact and are working with the facility, whichever one it may be, that's going to take them in with their policy.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about experiences. Somebody is in for 28 days. What types of things would be happening? Okay, they go through the detox if that were necessary. They do detox, and then now they have how many days left? They have 20-some days.
Something like that.
So what typically goes on? Tell us maybe what a typical day would be for somebody in an inpatient situation.
Sure.
What would be happening?
So it should be a pretty booked schedule. It should keep them pretty busy from sun up to sundown and then some. I believe that the best approach is several modalities and exposure to several different approaches to recovery, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We hear a lot about the 12 steps. So in a lot of the facilities that we work with in our facility, we're very big on the 12 steps. However, it's not the only modality that we expose patients to. So there's also, in addition to AA and NA, and starting to get patients used to that way of thinking and that way of recovery, there's also smart recovery. They might be involved in cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acupuncture, Reiki therapy, yoga therapy, fitness. Individual sessions with their patient or with their therapist several times a week, and group sessions with several patients in their therapeutic sessions several times a week as well. Different life skills workshops, perhaps some career workshops, depending on what age bracket they're in. I also think it's important that while they're in their treatment stay, they're grouped into populations of patients that are similar to what similar demographics as themselves. So, what we found early on is that, the 65-year-old alcoholic was having a hard time relating in group to the 18-year-old heroin addict, right?
Sure.
So for that reason, we split our patients up. We have a young males unit, we have a young females unit, we have a first responders unit, we have an evolutions program for older adults, we have a prize program, which is for chronic relapse patients who maybe have been in had numerous treatment episodes elsewhere, but for whatever reason, one reason or another, have found long-term recovery elusive. So that's a more intensive program that patients have to apply to get into. But we want patients to feel like they can connect with one another, because at the end of the day, the disease of addiction is a very isolating one. It's a very lonely one. So one of the first things and the best things we can do in breaking down that initial barrier is getting patients connected to one another, and eliminating that isolated feeling.
Sure. Now, what about co-occurring? Can you talk a little bit about what maybe people don't understand or know? I mean, I'm no expert. What the word co-occurring disorder means. Can you define that?
Yeah, co-occurring disorder means that a patient whose primary diagnosis is substance use disorder, oftentimes they have something else going on. There's an underlying factor there. So whether that's bipolar, anxiety, ADHD, depression, trauma, a lot of patients, in fact, I would say more than half of the patients that we see have some sort of underlying trauma. So it's really important to not only treat what's at the surface level and the issues that are presenting themselves. All right, the patient's using heroin 7 days a week. That part's obvious. Why?
Right.
Why is that?
Sure.
So it's important to diagnose and figure out what's going on under the surface and how can we get to that. So any reputable facility should be looking at those things and treating them accordingly.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So what should a loved one, families of a loved one, what's their part in all this? How do they fit into this puzzle with their loved one or themselves, their family? How does that equate to this whole picture of recovery for the individual?
Sure. I firmly believe addiction to be a family disease, not an individual disease. Now, granted, not every patient coming into treatment is fortunate enough to have a loving family by their side who wants to support them. In the cases of those patients who do have that support system and a family who wants to help, typically that family has been ravaged by the disease of addiction. The patient, the loved one is using 7 days a week, but the mom, the dad, they're not getting any sleep. They're trying everything under the sun, but a lot of families are operating with minimal to zero knowledge or experience on this thing. So the best thing they can do is get involved in the treatment and recovery process early on. Most treatment providers these days have family programs that accompany the individual programs during the treatment stay. So the best thing that parents or loved ones can do is get involved, go to the facility, see what types of educational programs they offer, and get educated, because what a loved one might instinctively think to do to help their loved one, so what a parent might want to do for their child might actually be doing more harm than good. So it's very important to get educated as quickly as possible and know what's helpful, what's hurtful. And so that way, when the patient returns home at some point in time, they're coming into the most loving, supportive, and therapeutic family dynamic that they possibly can.
So you mentioned parents get involved. I recall our situation, we traveled, and that was another question I wanted to ask you. But before I do that, we as a family went for a weekend. Not everybody may be local, but people are encouraged. Is there like is a weekend program that of benefit where I can remember going, and exactly to your point, they would talk about what was going on and the disease being a family disease, and do you think that that's of benefit to bring the family in while the loved one's in treatment?
Absolutely, absolutely. I can speak for RCA. I know that we have a Seeds to Recovery program, which is held the second weekend of every month, and that's
Right.
open to the public. It's not just for patients of RCA. It's open to any loved ones in the community that might be concerned about their loved one. But absolutely. So what we do there is we educate the family on the disease of addiction. Here are the signs and symptoms. Here are some ways that you can be helpful, and here are some things that you might be doing that you might not even know it that might be hurtful. And then what we do is we bring patients and families together and let them have a healthy form of connection and conversation with one another before they get out of treatment. Because oftentimes, without any guidance, those first interactions after treatment or towards the end of the treatment stay can be really stressful. Naturally, the mom, the dad is going to say, what's your plan after you get out of treatment? What are you going to be doing? What have you been learning in here? Are you going to use again? All these questions, which could be very stressful and sometimes even triggering for patients, and they don't know how to have that initial conversation. So having that conversation within the confines of treatment with some experts who are there to kind of supervise and facilitate that initial conversation and connection again is a really, really helpful thing and very beneficial.
Yeah, because I think that the entire dynamics and communication amongst loved ones definitely has to take a total, like 360 almost,
Yes.
or a shift.
Yes.
Because again, I mean, just from my own experience, I recall that the disease really wreaked havoc on us as a family.
Yeah.
And each individual perceived the disease differently, had a different type of response to the disease,
Yep.
reacted differently to Nicholas. And it definitely is a long journey to get into a place that's healthy for everybody.
Yeah. And it's not an overnight success. It's not an overnight matter by any means.
Right.
You're absolutely right. Oftentimes, more often than not, when a patient shows up at treatment, the family communication, the family dynamic is injured brutally in a lot of times, in a lot of cases. And when we get in there, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, they're at kind of a stalemate as far as what to even say to one another. Where do we go from here? So to have family counselors and couples counselors on site who can facilitate that initial connection again and kind of guide the conversation in a way that's going to be helpful builds that foundation upon which, once discharged from treatment, can continue autonomously beyond that. But that initial conversation and initial healing process for the family itself is so important. And, God knows that everyone's probably tried to fix and solve the problem within their own family unit before the treatment episode itself. So when families come in with their hands up and, we don't know what to do anymore, to have a professional who has tons of experience kind of guiding that conversation, it's really helpful. And I think it's really comforting as well to patients and families alike.
So let's take another turn that maybe there's people who don't want anything to do with their loved one.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that. It's a piece of frustration that just takes you to a point where I'm done, you're on your own, and you have to figure this out for yourself.
Yeah.
Now, so how do people in treatment, how do they respond to that, or how do they move forward in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and who could blame loved ones at that point in time? I mean, when you really love someone and you feel like you've tried everything you possibly can and nothing's working, kind of the last ditch effort is to see if, a hands-off approach works, right? So we see that all the time. And oftentimes the response to that can be anywhere from completely getting it. Sometimes patients really, okay, I've really tested my limits here, and I will show through my actions versus my words, that I can recover and I can do this. Other times it can breed a great degree of resentment, and patients can be really angry. And how could you leave me on my own like this? How could you abandon me in the time that I needed you most? That kind of thing. And what's most helpful, and I know that for RCA and most other treatment centers out there, is having individuals who are in recovery themselves to share their experience, strength, and hope with those individuals who are early on. I think that's one of the biggest things. I mean, in life in general, as well as in recovery, it's no different. Having someone who's been in your shoes, who has a message of recovery, a message that carries depth and weight, that can relate to you and say, hey, I've been there, and I've also worked with a lot of individuals and seen the following things happen. And that gives a little bit of evidence to the loved one that even if your loved one isn't willing to speak with you today, even if your mom, your dad, your husband, your wife isn't willing to talk to you today, here are a couple next steps we can take, and then we can try again. And that might not always work. Maybe we have to take another couple steps, and then we'll reach out again and see how that looks at that point in time. But hearing success stories from individuals who have actually been there, I think, means a great deal.
Sure. So, okay, the 28 days is approaching.
Yep.
And the individual has done their work.
Yep.
And where do they go from there?
Yeah.
Okay, they're approaching their last week or several days of treatment.
Yeah.
What are their options? And like you talked about, people who have been there.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody's coming out of treatment. What are their options?
Sure. So just to revert back to an earlier question that you had asked, what should I look for in a reputable treatment center? One thing that I failed to mention was aftercare planning.
Okay.
While I'd love to tell you that patients come into a treatment center like Recovery Centers of America and get cured, it's not the case with this disease.
No.
It's not the case.
It's not.
It's not a cure-all. It is but a first step on a lifelong journey through recovery. So, while it is important to stabilize and, go through that first 28 days, the real work comes after that. So what happens next is vitally important, in my opinion. And there are several options. I mean, sometimes patients want to go with the path of least resistance, which oftentimes is to go back home with the family, in which case I sure hope that that family did some self-educating through the family services that might be offered in order to make sure that that environment they're going home to is as constructive and conducive to the recovery as possible. In other cases, I think the best thing they could do is get enrolled in an outpatient program to step down, and as well as maybe even a recovery house or a sober living house. Now, the idea behind both of those modalities is accountability, it's connection, it's community. So if your life prior to treatment looked like you were a lone wolf and you were just out there running the streets, whether you were using heroin or drinking at the bar by yourself or with a group of friends, it's really important that you're not going to be with that same group of friends or at the same bars and just try not to drink. That's not going to be helpful to you at all. So it's really important to be involved in some sort of community once you get out of treatment. And oftentimes these recovery houses are great. They have individuals who are all attending 12-step meetings. They have some different responsibilities around the house. You're expected to pay some rent, so financially you have an obligation, but it's not, prohibitively expensive, that kind of thing. And, my experience in my own recovery has been through 12-step fellowships. And I think that's vitally important as well, because one thing that a 12-step fellowship will do, in addition to keeping you accountable and having you make new connections with individuals that are on the same path as you and you can relate to, is they'll take you through the 12 steps. And the 12 steps are designed to address that thing in you that causes you to keep going back to the drink or the drug. And I think that's vitally important, because there's the old adage, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And,
Sure.
So for me, the 12 steps elicited a profound, what the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous calls a psychic change within me. It changed my entire outlook and perspective on life, and turned me from an individual who is constantly consumed with how do I feel better and how do I self-medicate, and I have all these emotions coming up within me and I just want to feel better, to someone who is more focused on helping others, and that's a more sustainable way for me to feel good in my daily life.
So in a recovery center then, or a recovery community, there's other individuals working the same way as the individual to stay clean and do the right thing. So that's a whole nother culture shift too. Here they are with people who, there's no obviously exposure to alcohol or drugs in this environment, and that's a more positive way for people to continue their journey
Yep.
of sobriety.
Yep.
And that's really important.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, and I'll just say this for the parents of any young kids out there. When I say young kids, I'm talking, you know, anywhere from teenager
Right,
to
to
like,
20s.
you know, 20s, even 30s. I think the stigma oftentimes for patients and somebody going into the recovery process is that life's not going to be fun anymore
Yeah,
without
right.
drugs and alcohol.
Sure,
That was my
sure.
biggest fear. When I first
Right.
got clean, I was 24 years old, and I was so fearful that I wasn't going to have fun anymore.
Right.
Maybe I wouldn't get in trouble anymore.
Right.
Maybe my life wouldn't look like a disaster, but how was I going to have any fun or
Right.
laugh again?
It's a whole different way of life.
It is.
Right.
It really
It's
is.
huge.
And that's scary.
Sure.
But I'm here to report that myself and tons of others, I know hundreds of guys and girls
That's
in
great.
recovery that are having a blast. Yeah,
That's
that are
wonderful.
doing things that, you know, they say it in the program all the time. And when I refer to the program, I mean AA or NA. They say in the program, a life beyond your wildest dreams. And that is truly what the recovery process has given me.
Sure.
Not only have I hit career successes and milestones that I never thought I would, but in my personal life, I'm having a great time, and I haven't had to sacrifice fun one bit. In fact, if I look back on my life in active addiction and alcoholism, it doesn't look like much fun in hindsight. It looks like a big unmanageable mess.
Sure.
And
Sure.
the last few years of my life have been a blessing, and I've had a ton of laughs, a ton of great times, taken vacations, met new friends, had new experiences. Every day is a new experience, and it's a lot of fun.
Living a clean and sober life.
Yeah, and
So
it's
that's
fun.
wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great. So there is hope.
Absolutely.
There is hope.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's
That's
the best.
great. That's wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
it's been great. I think this has been a wonderful discussion, and I think that you've given people a lot of really good information as to how they or their loved ones can get help and how the family fits into that whole puzzle. And it's been very, very, very exciting to hear you speak. So if people want to get more information or they want to speak to you directly, how would they access you?
Sure. I'm out in the community all the time, and somebody can email me or call or text me.
Okay.
My direct line is 267-679-0423.
Right.
They can call or text me 24/7.
Okay.
And my email address, I believe it's listed on screen, is bkoroncai@recoverycoa.com. And I encourage any individual struggling or loved one out there with an individual who's struggling to contact me at any time. I would love to have a conversation.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful.
Absolutely.
That's great. You've been wonderful. So anyway, thank you for joining us for this important discussion. I'm Brenda Schivito, and remember that you are not alone in the battle against the disease of addiction. If you or a loved one need help, visit us anytime at angelsagainstaddiction.org. I believe that together we can save lives.